This is VOA Africa. Good evening and welcome. I'm Vincent McCory in for Esther Githui-Ewart. It's Thursday, March the 5th. This is Africa 54. Tanzanian health authorities are on high alert to stop the spread of the coronavirus. A new report sounds the alarm on the struggle for democracy worldwide. And we'll have a report on the possible economic impact of the COVID-19 outbreak on African airlines. Well, in the fight against the coronavirus, the U.S. Senate is expected to pass an $8 billion emergency spending bill Thursday to tackle COVID-19. The states of Washington, California, and Florida have declared emergencies due to the coronavirus. Meanwhile, South Africa is confirming its first case of COVID-19. Health Minister Zweli Mkhize says the patient, 38-year-old man from the eastern KwaZulu-Natal province, had traveled to Italy with his wife before returning to South Africa on March 1st. Mkhize says the man, who is now under self-isolation, exhibited symptoms of fever, headache, a sore throat, and a cough. South Africa has identified 13 hospitals equipped with, to treat patients and has implemented screening at the continent's busiest airport in Johannesburg. Well, Tanzania is said to be one of the African countries most at high risk of importing the coronavirus because of its high trade volume with China. At Tanzania's largest market, traders are feeling the crunch as the availability of Chinese-made goods is shrinking. Meanwhile, authorities are preparing to prevent further transmission with intensified surveillance at the nation's ports. Charles Kompe reports from Dar es Salaam.
Dar es Salaam's Kariakoo market is the biggest in Tanzania and depends on manufactured products imported from China. But the outbreak of coronavirus, known as COVID-19, has dried up shipments from China.
You sell phones and you find the stock is finished. You need a certain type of phone. Didn't get it at the time, and at the same time, the prices rise.
Those close trade ties with China makes Tanzania one of the African countries most at risk of importing COVID-19. Health authorities are on high alert.
The biggest aspect of which we have done within the country is to strengthen the port of entry, because as you know now, our threat is actually a case coming from the 58 affected countries, including China. And we have strengthened the port of entry. We have employed 100 more staff in the port of entries, and we have built their capacity to be able to detect the cases.
Tanzania's health ministry say they have 140 thermoscanners set up in all ports of entry.
Kwanza tumekuwa na vifaa vya kisasa kama mnavyoviona.
Firstly, we have modern equipment, as you can see, but also we have a modern ambulance for sending patients to hospitals, and the number of our professionals has doubled to make sure we fight this. We have been finding some suspected cases. Despite being found ill, this shows our machines are working properly.
In Tanzania's more remote areas, such as the tourist city of Arusha, the East African Community's Mobile Lab project helps test suspected coronavirus infections.
With this capacity, the partner states will be able to respond quickly, and if the outbreaks occur in remote areas where there may not be diagnostic capacity, the idea is that the mobile laboratory can move quickly and set themselves up in this remote area and then start diagnosing cases.
Meanwhile, Tanzanian doctors are urging everyone to take precautions to avoid the virus.
The biggest part involves your personal hygiene. When you enter and leave the washroom, make sure you wash your hands with soap. But also, we advise people to avoid contact. And if someone has a cough, they should cover their mouth.
But avoiding physical contact in the busy market is a challenge for traders like Hawadi. Even though the virus is a threat to their lives, without regular shipment of Chinese products, it's a bigger threat to their livelihoods. Charles Kombe for VOA News, Dar es Salaam.
But while reports from places where coronavirus has spread show images of people wearing surgical masks, health experts say they are not the most effective protection against the spread of the illness. As Brown Benito reports, there are other more effective ways to protect yourself and others from contamination.
As coronavirus continues to spread, people are rushing to buy protective masks, and supply can't keep up with the demand. That is worrying public health agencies.
I do understand why so many people are lining up to get masks, but we also don't want to run out of masks for our healthcare providers, because that will be a really serious problem for our entire healthcare system.
There's no role for these masks in the community. These masks need to be prioritized for healthcare professionals that, as part of their job, are taking care of individuals and/or individuals who have this virus and are in home isolation or home quarantine for those family members.
And wearing them will not necessarily prevent contamination.
If you're the one wearing the mask, you probably are getting a false sense of security.
That's because viruses land on things you touch throughout the day. Railings, seats, doorknobs, money.
But things that we can do to protect ourselves is wash our hands a lot, try not to touch our face, elbow bump instead of shaking hands. But also, don't sit in an environment with poor ventilation with somebody who's sick.
Like cars and cabs.
If you're sitting in a car and it's on recirc, you are rebreathing your breath and that of everybody else in the car.
Milton says this means an infected person should be wearing a mask to keep from releasing the virus into the air in respiratory droplets.
Droplets that flew from your nose or mouth to someone else's.
All of this is why the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control say following simple rules can help curb the spread of the virus.
Everyday measures like covering your cough or sneeze, staying home when you're sick, are very important. And of course, the evergreen, wash your hands.
So hashtag cover your mouth. And don't forget to
wash your hands and elbow bump and put a surgical mask on the sick person.
Bronwyn Benito, VOA News, Washington.
Well, the nonprofit group Freedom House has released its annual report on freedom and the state of democracy around the world. Continuing a 14-year trend, some of the findings are discouraging. As VOA's Arasha Rabasadu reports, the group says individual freedoms and democratic systems are under attack.
Freedom House's annual report says democracy and freedom are in a state of decline around the world. From crackdowns of demonstrators in Hong Kong protesting Chinese rule to repression of crowds in Iran demanding change in the Islamic Republic. The report shows regimes using brute force to maintain control. It also notes disturbing trends in some advanced democracies.
Democracy is in trouble. This year, we've seen an assault on equal rights and the rights of vulnerable groups in both democracies and under brutal regimes. All of this has added up to this being the 14th consecutive year of decline in global democracy.
Sarah Rapucci is Vice President of Research and Analysis at Freedom House. She says more governments have targeted religious and ethnic minorities.
There is definitely a real trend of countries scapegoating a minority population or testing out techniques on a minority population that then they spread more widely.
Rapucci says repressive societies like China use surveillance first on smaller scales before expanding to monitor and control the country at large. Despite that, she says, people in Hong Kong show a determination to fight for freedom.
It's quite clear from the demonstrations in Hong Kong that those people see freedom and democracy as just as important as people in other parts of the world. The movement in Hong Kong is incredibly important and needs to be supported so that the Chinese government wakes up to the reality of what their people want.
Benin had flawed elections last year. Rapucci says the country's freedom and democracy score dropped to levels typically reserved for countries that have a coup or a war.
To have such an extreme change due to an election in a country that had been one of Africa, and especially West Africa's success stories, is very troubling for the trajectory of democracy in Africa.
She adds that some countries show progress.
Sudan overall is one of the bright spots of the past year. The fact that a popular movement was able to overthrow a president who had been in power for 30 years and had been convicted of genocide is an enormous story.
Rapucci says hope comes from citizens willing to rise up. Even so, Freedom House's annual report shows that countries suffering setbacks outnumber those making gains by a margin of 2 to 1. Arash Arabasadi, VOA News, Washington.
Well, February was Black History Month in the United States, a time to celebrate achievements by African Americans in U.S. history. VOA's Thierry Corey takes us to one Washington, D.C. library where kids participated in Read Africa Week, an opportunity to learn about their ancestors' origins.
Let's find out about where we come from. How many regions are divided?
In the second edition of Read Africa Week, Anna Mwalago, a poet, actress, and Kenyan dancer, told the little ones the story of Lola, the blackbird, and the chameleon.
And the lesson here was to love yourself, be grateful for what God has given you in terms of your talents, your gifts, and who you are.
Along with their parents, most of whom are African, these children say they have learned a lot about African American history.
I learned about the story when she said the words. When she said about the words of the witch, like a witch, and I love when we close our eyes.
I'm a first-generation West African American, so my mother's from Liberia, my father's from the Gambia, so I'm very deeply rooted, and it's very important for my daughter to know where her ancestors come from and be very proud of that.
Read Africa is a program of the Gambian Education Partnership in collaboration with the DC Library, which aim to give Americans who have a limited knowledge of Africa precise and balanced books, which has been approved by researchers in African studies.
It's introducing kids to books that have been vetted by Africa Access and have been vetted to make sure the books show an accurate vision of Africa.
Mary Aisher, the Francis Gregory Library manager, says bringing together children for this program was important for the community.
In this part of the city, most of the children that visit the library and that go to school here are African American, and we would like to make sure that we celebrate Black History Month as fully as possible.
This celebration was also an opportunity for these children to try out African musical instruments and danced along with their parents. Thierry Kaore for VOA News, Washington.
Well, we're excited to hear what you think about Africa 54. Join the discussion on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. We're also streaming our broadcast live on Facebook. Please watch and share our show with your friends. Also, check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Still to come, African Airlines prepare to take a big hit to their bottom line due to the coronavirus outbreak.
Welcome to Straight Talk Africa, live from the Voice of America headquarters here in Washington. I am Shaka Sali. Straight Talk Africa, we call it like it is. We discuss issues that reflect the interests of our audience without fear or favor. We are guided by facts, and I look at myself as a servant of nothing but the truth.
I'm Clara Frank, and here's what's trending. Anyone who thinks a mine is no place for a woman obviously hasn't met Tena Konate. She drives a 72-ton dump truck at the Houndé gold mine in Burkina Faso. There are now 111 women workers at Houndé, around 11% of the workforce. But Endeavour Mining says 20 to 30% of their total workforce will be made up of women in the near future, while the world's biggest mining company, BHP Billiton, is aiming for a gender-balanced workforce by 2025. Next up, Bata Nigeria is a franchise tied to Bata, a historic shoe company based in Switzerland and present in 70 countries. This factory, which opened in late 2019, can produce more than 500,000 shoes annually. It employs roughly 120 people. Bata Nigeria also sells shoes directly to Nigerian schools for pupils as part of their uniform and stocks other stores in the country. Nigeria's government hopes companies like Bata can spur the local manufacturing sector, create jobs, and reduce Africa's biggest economy's reliance on oil sales. It has tried to stimulate this with its long-running Made in Nigeria agenda, which included placing import restrictions on shoes in 2007. And finally, Southeast Asia has a plastic waste crisis, and a lot of it ends up in landfills or polluting waterways. But Wendy Nyamwe had a simple idea. Waste could be turned into a work of art. She's the face behind Chuchu, the Burmese word for plastic house. She collects plastic bottles, plastic bags, and even old umbrellas, cleans them, and irons strips of different layers of plastic. They become wallets made out of tough plastic sacks, belts out of old tires. When she's not sewing plastic designs in her workshop, she also finds time to run classes, teaching local women how to craft new things from scavenged waste. And that's what's trending today.
Well, former U.S. Vice President Joe Biden is riding a wave of momentum after key victories in many of the Super Tuesday primaries. Biden's dramatic political comeback has reshaped the Democratic primary battle into a two-man race between himself and Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. VOA national correspondent Jim Malone has more on where the race is now headed.
For Democrat Joe Biden, Super Tuesday victories in a host of states capped a political comeback that few could have predicted just days ago.
We want a nominee who will beat Donald Trump, but also keep Nancy Pelosi the Speaker of the House. Win back the United States Senate. If that's what you want, join us.
Biden swept a victory in several southern states thanks to strong support from African-American voters. The former vice president has now dramatically recast the Democratic race as a two-man showdown with Senator Bernie Sanders. Sanders did win the largest state voting on Super Tuesday, California, and now casts himself as an underdog fighting the Democratic Party establishment.
There has been never a campaign in recent history which has taken on the entire political establishment, and that is an establishment which is working frantically to try to defeat us.
Biden now stands to benefit from the endorsement of former New York City mayor and billionaire Michael Bloomberg. Bloomberg dropped out of the race Wednesday after spending $500 million on TV ads, but he vowed to help defeat President Trump.
Victory in November. Not victory for me or our campaign, but victory for our country.
Biden's political fortunes took a dramatic turn after his victory last week in the South Carolina primary. Democratic strategist Penny Lee was a guest on VOA's Plugged In program.
Joe Biden winning in places like Virginia without any infrastructure whatsoever. I mean, not an office, hadn't spent a dime on Monday. You saw record crowds, though, turn out and saw them turn out for Joe Biden. So you saw a real amazing seismic shift in who the voter preference was in just a very short time.
A big reason for Biden's surge was Democratic voters making a key decision, says expert Laura Brown.
That much of Vice President Biden's support last night was not simply about being a for Biden vote as much as it was an against a Sanders nomination.
The Super Tuesday primary showed that most Democratic voters have one overriding priority, says Larry Sabato.
Because the one thing that Democrats want more than anything, and far more than usual, is to defeat the incumbent. The intense dislike of Donald Trump is palpable.
Sanders came close to beating Hillary Clinton 4 years ago, but may have a more difficult challenge this time facing Biden, says analyst David Barker.
A substantial portion of Sanders' support in 2016 is really more anti-Hillary than it was pro-Sanders. And the fear and loathing of the current incumbent president is much, much greater than it was of the former president. And so this is part of what's fueling Biden's comeback, and that's going to continue.
Biden and Sanders square off next week in primaries in Michigan, Mississippi, Missouri, and Washington State. Jim Malone, VOA News, Washington.
Well, African Airlines are facing a massive hit of up to $40 billion from the coronavirus outbreak, according to an airline industry association. Lucy Fielder has the details.
The coronavirus epidemic could cost African airlines tens of millions of dollars in revenue this year, a global industry body has said, in a potentially devastating hit to often struggling airlines that count on lucrative Chinese routes to fund their expansion. Airlines around the world have suspended or modified flights amid the outbreak, which began in mainland China at the end of last year and has now spread to more than 60 countries worldwide. The global cost to the aviation industry is projected to be $29 billion this year, the International Air Transport Association has said. And at a conference in Addis Ababa on Wednesday, the organisation's special envoy to Africa said African airlines face a hit of as much as $40 million. The IATA had already forecast before the outbreak that African airlines would make a loss of around $200 million this year. Tewolde Gebre-Mariam, chief executive of the continent's biggest carrier, Ethiopia Airlines, said the company had seen air travel demand decline by 20%. His airline has faced criticism online for not cancelling flights to China, as Kenya, Tanzania and Rwanda have done. On Tuesday, Kenya also halted direct flights from 2 cities in northern Italy, the location of the biggest cluster of coronavirus cases in Europe.
Well, that was Lucy Fielder of Reuters reporting. Now, a top United Nations official says African governments must do more to fight poverty and hunger to meet 2030 agenda goals for sustainable development. Columbus Mavunga reports from Victoria Falls, Zimbabwe, where a UN commission is holding its 6th session on sustainable development.
Speaking at a regional Sustainable Development Forum, UN Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed urged African governments to do more against poverty and hunger.
The absolute number of people living in poverty on the continent has been increasing since 2013, owing in part to high population growth rates. That number has now reached 428 million people. Africa also has the highest prevalence of hunger, with 22.8 million people severely food insecure, many of whom have to go to bed hungry.
Just a few minutes drive from the Victoria Falls meeting, Xolani Moyo says he deals with poverty and hunger every day and has been locked in cycle of poverty since his father died.
I only have 2 chickens. I do not even have a decent home. There is hunger here, as we have to buy food from shops. If you plant crops, the sun burns them, or heavy rains destroy the plants. I wish the president would come here, and I would tell him to give us jobs.
President Emmerson Mnangagwa says his government is making strides against poverty and hunger by investing in renewable energy, health, education, agriculture, and infrastructure. He blames climate change for many development setbacks.
The African continent contributes less to climate change, yet it is the most severely affected continent. Mitigation of climate change must be prioritized in line with the Paris Agreement. Climate change is real, as evidenced by the droughts that are ravaging our continent. For us in Zimbabwe, the ripple effects of climate change were felt in every sector of our society.
The United Nations says the recurring droughts, together with the collapsing economy, have made more than half of Zimbabwe's population food insecure. Moyo, meanwhile, is calling for changes soon. He has no sanitary drinking water or bathroom and no job, and it's unclear when or if his life will get easier. Columbus Mavunga, VOA News, Victoria Falls, Zimbabwe.
Well, and that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, have a good evening.
From around the world. Let's go.